Hey everyone, welcome back to the Navigating History podcast. This is season 1, episode 4 on the Battle of the Persian Gate. I'm your host, Andrew, as always, and as you may have noticed if you're watching this on YouTube, this is the first episode where you're seeing my face. So, hey, this is what I look like. Yes, if you follow me on TikTok, at navigating_history, you will have seen my face as well on there, or if you follow me on Instagram, a post would have been up on Instagram as well. But for the YouTube audience only, this is the first time you're seeing my face. Anyway, this episode is going to be on the Battle of the Persian Gate, and everything that happens leading up to it, and then a little bit of what happens after it, because what happens after it is kind of extremely important as well. So, in the 3 months that preceded, or the 3 months that followed the Battle of Gaugamela, the massive Macedonian victory at the Battle of Gaugamela, everything sort of was going the way of the Macedonians, right? Everything was going their way. There was Darius had fled at the battle. If you remember from last week's episode, Darius had fled, and Alexander and the Macedonians were the dominant force in the Persian Empire. And Alexander had his heart set on the Persian heartland, pardon the pun, but basically he had his eyes on the Persian heartland and wanted everything sort of to be, he was focused on capturing the Persian heartland and then really capturing the Persian Empire. He was the dominant force. They were in the ascendancy in this war, but he had everything set on capturing the Persian heartlands, especially the cities of Babylon and the cities of Susa. And so immediately following the battle, he marched his armies to those cities, and rather than fight and remain loyal to Darius, the Persian satraps of Babylon and Susa had a decision to make. Right, the word of how Alexander had treated previous captured Persian satraps had got around, right? And basically he allowed the old regime to remain in power pretty much, and local governments to remain the same so long as they swore fealty and paid tribute to him. So that's what they decided to do. They decided that the best course of action for them was to make sure that their power was maintained. So they swore fealty to him. They made sure that they made sure that he was rewarded handsomely in terms of gold and wealth, but also they said, all right, we're going to pledge troops to you. We're going to make sure that you understand that you are 100% in charge, and we're just here. You know what I mean? We'll take care of the local administration stuff, but we're swear fealty to you, and that we acknowledge you as the new king of Persia, pretty much, and made sure that Alexander knew where their loyalties lied. And in my opinion, Alexander does this is a smart move from the position of the Persian satraps here, because not only are they remained in power, but now they're one of the few that have actually gone over willingly to the Macedonian side. So therefore it makes them look good amongst the loyal Persian satraps. Now they look good because they've done it willingly rather than being converted over for or rather than being conquered and then swearing fealty after conquered. These people have just they've sort of realized, all right, this is where we need to be, and this is what we need to do to preserve ourselves. And they could sort of see that the writing was on the wall, right? They could sort of see that Darius really was struggling, and yes, there were rumors that he was raising another army further into the Persian heartland, and that he was trying to fight back, and as he well probably was and should be, and we'll get to that in a later episode. But truthfully, they could see that Alexander was in the ascendancy. As I said, he was the dominant power in Persia now, and they wanted to be a part of that and be on the winning side, rather than fighting against him and losing and possibly dying, or possibly having their subjects dealt with in a negative way, in any sort of negative way whatsoever. Alexander sort of left them alone. They swore fealty and they gave him a ton of money, and then he sort of left them alone, which again, extremely smart on their side. And then Alexander did something with the money that I found extremely, extremely smart. This is one of the smartest things that he has ever really done. He made sure that his army was paid. And not just paid whatever their normal base salary for the year was. Or I'm not even sure if it worked like that. But he rewarded them and his army and his officers and his other Macedonian nobles that followed him specifically with enormous amounts of wealth. He really didn't take much of the money for himself. In fact, some of the money was sent to the League of Corinth back in Greece to help deal with a rebellion by the Spartans. But most of it was spent on his army, making sure that all the soldiers had a lot of money, making sure that they were all wealthy. He rewarded the loyalty of his men, right? If you remember back when this campaign started, back with the Battle of the Granicus River, they had no money. The Macedonian state, the Macedonian army had no money. They couldn't feed or house or pay their soldiers beyond a month, right? They had to, within that month, the first month there of the campaign, they had to either capture a major town or they had to win a major battle to even be allowed to continue the fighting, which they did in this case. And it's one of those things where he really did he did right by his soldiers, and is one of the things that makes him such a great military commander. Not just his tactical mind, and as we'll get to later in this episode, his tactical mind was, by this point he was slightly overconfident, but genuinely, again, this paying attention to the logistics of battle, paying attention to the logistics of running an army on campaign, something that Alexander did better than anybody else in the ancient world, in my opinion. This is something he did better, even at a young age, not an experienced commander. He was an experienced commander, but not experienced in terms of age, right? He did this better than any other commander in the entire Persian army. He did this better than anyone else. Or than the Persians, he did this better than everybody in the ancient world, because he was able to know what his army needed and why, and like the important things, and know what each soldier would want. What do they? What did the soldiers want? What do the everyday people in the army want? Not just the officers and the other nobles, or even his companion cavalry people. What does the average, member of a phalanx or a member of the light infantry want in this war? And that is money and wealth and prestige for themselves and their families, and protection against their families, other than obviously to return home to their families and whatnot. So he made sure that his soldiers were indebted to him. They had this massive amount of wealth. But without him, obviously they wouldn't have it. And they earned it, and in their rights, they earned the money. But at the same time, Alexander knew how important that, making sure that his army was taken care of was. He knew how important making sure his army was taken care of was, pardon me. And he made sure that everybody understood, all right, if we win, when we win as a team. Sort of very team dynamic, a very important team dynamic, right? We're in this together. I'm not taking a lot of the money here. The money is going to you guys, the army, to the people who won it for me, won this prestige, won this, right? All this territory that we now have in Persia now, because of you guys, right? All of this territory, he basically made them feel important, and there are many ways to do that, and this is one of them, and it's so crucial. For a campaign, for the army to feel loyal, and to feel valued, and to get compensated as well, because to be able to be, you can promise them you can promise them all you want, but they're not going to fight for you if you don't come up with results, not just on the battlefield, but in terms of paying them or rewarding them with what you say you're going to reward them. When we look at Julius Caesar and the Romans later in this, not this particular episode, but later on this podcast, in a different season, we'll get to the fact that Caesar's soldiers eventually didn't want to fight for him anymore when he was going into the civil war against Pompey. Spoilers for history, I guess. But when he was going into the civil war against Pompey, his soldiers didn't really want to fight because a lot of them were thinking, we didn't really get paid, right? He promised them all land and they hadn't been paid. Whereas in this case, Alexander made sure that his soldiers were rewarded with what he said he was going to reward them with. He made sure that everything was taken care of for them so that they could move on and they could continue the campaign. And that is extremely crucial. And now that we're done talking about Alexander's good things, let's talk about a couple of the bad things that he did. Actually, we have to talk about one more smart thing, but then we'll talk about some of the bad things that he did leading up to the Battle of the Persian Gate. So after capturing Susa and capturing Babylon, Alexander realized, okay, now we have two of the biggest and most two of the biggest and wealthiest cities in this part of the Persian Empire. We've got two of the most important ports and trading hubs, and we've got it. Things are looking up for us here. That now we have our hearts set on the Persian, the meat and potatoes of the empire, if you forgive that expression. Everything was focused now, and he had one path, the pathway through Susa, which he now had because the satrap in Susa had, declared loyalty for him, and through the Zagros Mountains. And Alexander does something smart. Again, he realizes that, the path through the mountains with the baggage train and the camp followers and everything is gonna, yes, that's the fastest way to go to get to the capital of Persepolis, and to get to the capital of Persepolis, which was the goal, right? This was the ceremonial capital of the Achaemenid Empire, right? The Persian Empire, the capital city of Persepolis, which was just on the other side of these mountains. He realized that it was there's a pass through the mountains, which was the fastest way. But he also realized that, taking the entire army with the baggage train and the camp followers through that pass was going to be very difficult and not a very good thing to do. It was going to go slow, and they couldn't move fast, and they're likely to be ambushed, to be perfectly honest with you. They're likely to be ambushed, and it's going to be a hell of a lot if they are ambushed. It's going to be a heck of a lot worse if they have a lot of, if they have a massive army with them that they have to, and people that aren't, and non-combatants as well with them, that they have to now get out and they have to deal with. And so Alexander splits his army into two. The bulk of his force, around 38 to 40,000 soldiers, as well as the baggage train and the camp followers, are given to Parmenion to command. And Parmenion then goes around the mountains, and Alexander takes a force of roughly 10,000 soldiers through the pass to try and get to the capital of Persepolis as fast as possible. Now, as I mentioned earlier, one of the biggest questions at the time for the Persian satraps, where it was, okay, what are we going to do? Are we going to remain loyal to, King Darius III? Are we going to remain loyal to our king? Or are we going to flip sides to Alexander, because he's clearly, a big threat here in the sphere of the ancient world, and he's really powerful in this area, and he's got a big army. So what are we going to do? What do we, and the Persian satrap of the Zagros Mountains, basically the person who owns the land around there, said, no, I'm going to remain loyal to Darius. So, as Alexander was marching through the mountains, he subdued one of the hill tribes, and basically, they had always demanded tribute from the Persian kings or Persian satraps who had marched their armies through. They'd never actually been subjugated before, and they'd always demanded tribute, and the Persians had just paid it because it was easier than fighting them. Alexander actually decides that he's going to fight, but he's not going to play by the old rules, right? He was a big fan of setting his own rules and saying, all right, I'm the one in charge now. I'm the one in charge. You're going to do what I say when I say it. And he sort of just, he basically encircled the town and then did what a lot of unfortunately, what a lot of ancient commanders did, which was just burn it and torture it people and kill innocent people, basically, which not a good guy, right? Like, and this is the thing, there are no good guys and bad guys in history. They're just facts, and this is what happened. You don't root. It's not like sports where you're rooting or like in a, or if you watch Marvel or anything, it's not like that where you're rooting for the Avengers to defeat Thanos because Thanos is obviously a bad guy. You're not rooting for Alexander to defeat the Persians because the Persians are obviously bad. It's just, this is what happened. This is interesting. This guy invaded this place. Anyway, so he subjugated this town, tortured its people, and all of the other surrounding tribes in the mountains basically went, oh shit, okay, this is not going to go well. Okay, if we do fight and we do demand tribute from the Macedonians, this is gonna suck, and it's gonna be bad for us. Alexander sort of laid down the law a bit here and said, all right, you're gonna follow my rules. And in fact, rather than paying tribute to them, he had them now paying a yearly tribute to him and to the satraps around that were under his control. He had them paying a yearly tribute instead. So he sort of countered this entirely. Anyway, so the whole point of me going off on this little tangent here was to show that Alexander had subjugated most of the region. So he wasn't expecting there to be a lot of resistance. In fact, as he marched through the pass, through the Zagros Mountains over several days, there was very little resistance, right? There was no organized resistance. That, in fact, it got to the point where Alexander didn't even didn't even send scouts out anymore because he assumed that the territory was pacified. I mean, definitely a mistake. And like I was talking about how, he'd made a lot of good choices at points, but this was definitely a mistake for him. This was something he definitely failed at. He didn't send scouts ahead through the pass to make sure that his army was going to be okay. He sort of just was like, yeah, we've subjugated them, so cool. Very nonchalant, very like, job done. All right, we're marching. You're not marching through even occupied. You didn't treat it as if you're marching through occupied territory. You treated it as like, you're marching through your own territory, which technically, if you're occupied, it is your own, but it's, that it wasn't hostile territory. He sort of treated it as if it wasn't hostile territory to him, and this was a problem because the Persian satrap, Ariobarzanes, and if I'm pronouncing that wrong, then I apologize. Again, I'm terrible with pronunciations for everything. But Ariobarzanes was very loyal to King Darius III, right? He decided, I'm going to be loyal to this guy. I'm with this guy. This guy is my king. I'm still going to be loyal to him. Because he heard the rumors that Darius was, building a massive army, and he thought, well, if I can defeat him, and he was tasked with defending the pass and defending the Persian heartland from Alexander. He was given that task by the king and said, here's what you're going to do. Darius was like, here's what you're going to do. I'm going to build the army and we're going to win. But you got to hold him first. You got to hold him so that he cannot get through the pass quickly, so that I have time to build that army. And Ariobarzanes was like, okay, I know how to do this. And he set up an ambush through the pass through the Zagros Mountains near the Persian Gate. The Persian Gate was the quickest way to get through to Persia proper and the city of Persepolis as well, right? It was the quickest way, and he set up an ambush because the pass initially was extremely wide, allowing the Macedonians to come in at full march and in a full phalanx, whereas eventually it narrowed and kept getting narrower and narrowed and narrower and narrower to the point where it was only a couple of meters apart. Think with COVID, you're supposed to stand 6 feet apart. Well, you could probably maybe fit two people 6 feet apart in the pass. It was very, very tight, especially for a military engagement. And Alexander, as I mentioned, didn't send any scouts forward and sort of just was like, just marching through, sort of not really paying attention, narrowed his forces, but was then ambushed, right? Ariobarzanes' forces ambushed him from atop the mountain passes and rained down projectiles and crashed into the Macedonian forces and absolutely devastated this small Macedonian force here. under Alexander. And this was the first time that Alexander had been defeated. This is the first time where Alexander has been outsmarted by a Persian general, because he really was. This was a masterstroke on the part of Ariobarzanes. This was absolutely like exactly what he needed to do. The only problem that he ran into was the fact that the Macedonians were extremely well trained and organized, and Alexander was able to organize a defense to some degree. Right? He had even blocked off part of the pass with rock and stone, like with stones, and had like dirt and covered, basically made it look like like a mini landslide or avalanche had happened, and that just rocks had piled up and that were blocking the way. So when the Macedonians went to clear it away, that's when they'd ambushed. He'd set them basically a rock wall that they couldn't get over, they couldn't go through, and had trapped them in this really tiny, narrow bit of land here in the pass near the Persian Gate. And it was a masterstroke. That's the only way to describe it. This was exactly the way, like if you're drawing up a battle plan, everything went exactly the way that Ariobarzanes planned. Everything happened exactly the way that he wanted it to. The only thing that didn't was that the Macedonians were so well trained and that things had gone so well, and Alexander was able to organize his men so quickly. And even then, they were able to massacre a ton of Macedonian troops. Eventually, Alexander ordered a retreat and was able to get his men out of the pass and onto the plains just near the Persian Gate. But again, this was after he'd lost a ton of his force. This was after his force had been absolutely decimated by the Persian ambush. And, Ariobarzanes, who did a perfect job. The only thing that he maybe could have done, or that maybe could have gone better for him, was stopping Alexander's escape. And if he had done that, then, and this is again, we're going back to when we're talking about the Battle of Granicus, the Battle of the Granicus River, and how if things had gone slightly different for Alexander there, then he would have possibly died and definitely lost, and his campaign against the Persians would have gone horribly. Right? Ever since then, it's been like going from win to win for the Macedonians. Right? They've Issus was a major win for them. Gaugamela was a major win for them. Granicus was a major win for them, but it was tight for a long time, and so was Issus. But you know what I mean? Like it's been like it hasn't been really tough for the Macedonians, and up until, from Granicus basically onwards, and Alexander got extremely lucky at the Granicus River, as I mentioned in my first episode. If you haven't seen episode 1 of the podcast, go check it out, because it's, obviously it's the first episode, but it's extremely, it's extremely important in developing this idea of Alexander being kind of lucky a little bit in a lot of his campaigns. Yes, he was a brilliant tactician, an extremely great motivator, and sort of had this aura of invincibility around him, which, again, didn't help his the reputation amongst his enemies, and helped, again, more, the morale of his men, thinking like, all right, our king is basically invincible. We're not going to lose, and we're going to be okay. But in this case, it's kind of shattered a little bit, right? He's defeated. This is the first Macedonian defeat on Persian soil. This is the first time they lose. He has to retreat, and in fact, he loses thousands of men to this attack, and the Persians win, and he has to retreat. And for several days, he's sort of talking with his advisors and going, what do we do? Right? We can't go back through the other way and meet up with Parmenian's force, or that was one of the options, right? To just go around the mountains and meet up with Parmenian's force. The whole point of splitting his army in two in the first place was to, sort of establish a foothold on the other side of the mountains, so that when Parmenian's force came across, they would be able to, take the city of Persepolis and make sure everything was good to go. But Alexander sort of wasn't sure. Okay, what do we do? How do we? It took them several days to sort of figure out a counterattack. That's how well done this was from a Persian standpoint. This was the best This was the best Persian moment so far in the war. This was it. And, this was the best use of Persian tactics. This was the best use of their forces. This was the best use of the terrain to their advantage. If you recall from Gaugamela, Darius tried to use the terrain to his advantage, but it ended up not working because of the way Alexander had deployed his troops on a diagonal instead of square ahead. This case, the Persians had the terrain advantage. They had the high ground, not to quote Obi-Wan, but from Star Wars, but I have the high ground, I'm going to win. And that's really genuinely what happened, is they had the high ground and they won. And Alexander sort of realized this. So, a couple of days after the initial Battle of the Persian Gate, Alexander splits his force again. So this sub-force that he had split from the main force, again, the majority of his forces were under the control of Parmenion. And they weren't, and were going around the mountains. So Alexander splits his force again here, and takes the majority of his army up into the mountains, like high into the mountains through tiny little passes. It was extremely difficult in the dark as well. I just want to take a second here. This was a daring, dangerous move because he's traveling in the dark, and you're trying to set an ambush and set in so it's extremely dangerous because you're going over unfamiliar terrain up a steep mountainside with all your equipment and all your everything, and sort of like it's extremely challenging. It would be extremely hard to even get up the mountain, let alone get up the mountain as silently as possible in secret with all of these different things happening. And he manages to take the bulk of his army. So, I don't know the exact numbers, but roughly, say 7,000 men, and hide them up in the mountain pass above where he knows Ariobarzanes' forces, so above where the Persians are. And then he splits, so the smaller force lights a whole bunch of campfires, right? They light enough campfires to make it look like the entire Persian force is still, the entire Macedonian force is still encamped, so that everything looks normal if the Persians are doing a scouting mission, or if they were scouting, or if they were to attack the camp, it would appear as though the full force of the camp was there. But in fact, only a small number of the Macedonians were still there. So then the small number of Macedonians marches through the Persian Gate and through that pass again, and basically is used as bait. Alexander uses his forces as bait to sort of, use them as bait to entrap the Persians. So same thing as before, right? Ariobarzanes doesn't realize that Alexander has, has sort of laid a trap for him and ambushes the small Macedonian force in the pass, and again attacks from on high like he should. Does basically what he should with the knowledge he has. He does everything right, but this time Alexander is ready for him, and they come down from the mountains on top of the Persians, and they not only do they secure the Persian camp on the other side of that rock wall that I mentioned that was set up in the middle of the pass, so they come down on the other side of that and attack the Persian camp and the Persian supplies and everything, that take the camp out. The small little camp for the Persians, take that out. But they also encircle the Persian forces that were trying to encircle their own forces, and now the Persians are stuck because they're fighting on two sides, right? Basically, history, at least specifically ancient and medieval and Renaissance history, can be summed up in, like, medieval or like combat can be summed up in, if your force is surrounded, you're kind of shit out of luck. You're kind of screwed. This is a bad time. You're gonna have a bad day, and that's exactly what happens. And Ariobarzanes is told, all right, like, you can yield, you can surrender, you can swear fealty, and maybe you'll be spared. You might be in prison for a long time, but you're gonna be spared. And he decides, to his credit, he's gonna fight on. He's going to continue fighting. He's going to do everything that he's going to fight because he's still loyal to Darius, and he wants to delay Alexander's force for as long as possible so that they can't get to the capital city and get to the heartland of the Persian Empire as fast as possible, right? he wants to make sure that for as long as possible they're held up in these mountains, and that, Darius has as much time to raise that army as possible. And he does his best and eventually fights to the last man. Literally, his army fights to the last man, and they're all massacred because they refuse to surrender. And that's the other thing about Alexander, at least from ancient sources, is that he's not cruel to the point where, he's not cruel without it serving a point, right? I talk about him subduing the hill tribes and how he put a village to the sword to make a point. But that was making a political statement of, I am the big dog in town, you're going to do what I say, right? Yes, it was cruel and horrible, and, looking at it from a modern standpoint, you're thinking, this is, like, horrible, how could you do this, right? But it served a purpose. He isn't going to... He understands, again, Alexander understands the need for, logistics and people that know the nation, that country that he's now conquering, right? He understands that you can't just kill everyone that, you can't just kill all of the Persians, because if you kill all the Persians, you have nobody else to rule over, and they don't know the terrain, or, right? You know what I mean? Like, he understands, like, I need these people. I need the people to run the empire for me when I'm gone. Right? He needs them to be there. He needs the Persian satraps to, the local Persian satraps of, Susa and Babylon to continue running their cities and their lands, and make sure that everything runs smoothly, because they know how to best run things smoothly. Alexander doesn't seem like he's cruel for no reason. So if he offers Ariobarzanes a chance at surrendering. In fact, one of the satraps of that we talked about, the satrap of Babylon, was Mazaeus from last week, who led the Persian forces against Alexander at the Battle of Gaugamela. He led the Persian forces twice against Alexander's force, and he was allowed to remain in his position as governor of Babylon because he swore fealty and realized, all right, I'm gonna, he swore fealty. He swore, and he paid tribute, and he was able to retain his position. And this was somebody that Alexander had fought against in the field, and who had tried to kill him less than 2 months ago at the time, right? Somebody who had tried to, can you imagine that? Somebody who tries to murder you 2 months ago, and then, you sort of walk into them, yeah, you can work for me now. Can you imagine walking into, I don't, say any of you, like, work in, like, an office, or, like, you walk into work and, you try and kill your boss, who you don't think is going to be your boss. You try and stop your boss from being your boss. And then he's your boss, and he's just like, okay, well, now everything's fine. You can work for me. It's fine. Alexander understood the importance of making sure that his people, the people in the Persian Empire that he was conquering, were ruled by Persians, not just ruled by Greeks. Because that's an important point, right? If the Greeks had just come in and said, all right, we're like, the Greeks wanted to be in control in Persia, but they didn't want to be the day-to-day administrators of Persia. They wanted to be in control and have the big, they wanted to expand partially in terms of their own people. But Alexander understood that if he was going to rule in Persia, he was going to be ruling over Persians. He was not just going to be ruling over the Greeks that were in Persia, right? Initially, if you remember from episode 1, his initial mindset for the war was to free the Greeks living under Persian rule. But he understood eventually, it sort of, I'm sure Alexander himself had these notions of grandeur, where he wanted to be, conqueror, and he wanted to conquer Persia, and he wanted to actually rule it himself. But he understood that he was going to be ruling over the Persians. So he offers Ariobarzanes this chance at surrendering, and Ariobarzanes turns him down and basically fights until the last man, and the Persians are wiped out and they die here. And I want to point that out, that Alexander, and a lot of other military commanders throughout all of ancient history, many of whom we'll get to on this podcast, they do a lot of things that are, again, by modern standards considered horrible. But Alexander doesn't do cruel things for no reason. He didn't. There was no reason for him to, like, again, in Babylon, there's no reason for him to kill Mazaeus, other than, like, if he were to kill him and install even a new Persian governor, all that would serve to do is make Messias a martyr, right? All it would serve to do is anger the Persians. So he's like, all right, as long as you swear fealty to me and we don't have any more problems, it's fine. Everything's going to be fine. And it's sort of just really, it makes the point that Ariobarzanes was so loyal to Darius that he was willing to die for his beliefs. So credit to the man. He did everything that he could do to prevent Alexander from making it out of those mountains. He did everything in his power, including giving up his own life, to make sure that Alexander couldn't get out of the mountains. And it was important that he did, because, again, the capital city of Persepolis was on the other side of the Persian Gate. The ceremonial capital, the first capital of the Persian Empire proper, the first. It was a big deal and a huge symbol. And this is part of the reason why Alexander wanted to go through the pass and capture it so quickly. It was a symbol, right? The person who held Persepolis was basically the undisputed king of Persia. And Alexander wanted this. He wanted this city, right? This was a big deal for him. This wasn't just capturing some other town. This wasn't like the siege of Tyre, or this wasn't, as much as important as those conquests had been, this was sort of the crown jewel of the Persian Empire at the time, and he wanted a shot at it. And this blockade that Ariobarzanes put in place was sort of the last organized Persian defense against Alexander taking the city of Persepolis. And he knew that, Darius or any of the other Persian satraps couldn't really raise a massive, massive army in time to get to Persepolis if Alexander was able to go through the pass with his smaller force of, 10 or so thousand men and sort of establish a garrison there and sort of defend the city and wait until Parmenides' forces arrived. That was his plan. And he was able to do that because of everything that happened with Ariobarzanes, and the fact that he was able to win despite being outnumbered 4-1. Ariobarzanes had roughly 40,000 men that ambushed Alexander initially. And again, it shows you the value of the high ground, right? Ariobarzanes could have probably had, 3,000-4,000 men when, if the first time that Alexander marched to the Persian Gate, if he'd done this, if he'd, used the same tactics, but he only had 4,000 men and Alexander had 40,000, as long as they were, stocked with arrows and you blocked off each end of the pass, all you have to do is rain arrows down on them and they will die in the thousands. It was such a crucial tactic. It's so useful. And again, if Alexander had not escaped, if he had not been able to cut his way free and escape the first time, the entire landscape of ancient history could have been completely changed. That's why this battle was so important. Not only because it allowed the Macedonians to be on the doorstep of the ceremonial capital for the Persians, but because the Macedonians almost completely lost. Again, this is the first time since the Battle of the Granicus River where Alexander was in genuine, danger of dying. Yes, obviously he was in battle and you could die in battle, but this was the closest his army had come to defeat since the Battle of the Granicus River. The closest that his army had come to defeat without a plan, right? Where, obviously, at the Battle of Issus and at the Battle of Gaugamela, there are times in each battle where it looks like the Persians could win. But in each of those times, Alexander had a plan for a counterattack, and here he didn't. Here he was caught. Here he was outsmarted. This is the first time since the Battle of the Granicus River, and in fact, including that because Alexander's forces eventually won, and partially because of him. And definitely because of his strategy, they ended up winning at the Granicus River. Again, go watch season 1, episode 1, or listen to it on Spotify or Google Podcasts if you haven't already. But this is the first time that he's out in his military career that he is outsmarted. In his entire military career, which at this point is going on almost about 10 years, this is the first time that he had been outsmarted. And that's why this is so crucial, because even if he had lost here, if he'd been killed here, you know, the entire Macedonian invasion of Persia would have fallen apart, and the Persians would have won, even though they had lost every other military engagement to this point. Alexander would have died, and the Persians would have won. And again, the difference was either Alexander's on the doorstep of their capital or he's dead. He was either going to be on the doorstep of the capital or killed. So it's extremely important, and the fact that Alexander's forces are still able to overcome the overwhelming odds at the Battle of the Persian Gate and come through and really actually ended up still winning the battle, so incredibly important. And I want to just point that out, that exactly, it was one of the craziest. It's one of the craziest battles of this entire campaign, in my opinion. Gaugamela and Issus kind of have this, they kind of follow a standard pattern. This does not follow that pattern, and sort of has these, it sort of has this what if moment. I wonder what could have happened if something had gone slightly different here. Same sort of as the Battle of Granicus River does, where if Alexander, if the blade had cut a little bit deeper into Alexander's skull, he would have been dead. If the spear if Alexander hadn't got his shield up in time, he would have been dead. There are examples from that battle of Alexander being, extremely vulnerable, and this is the most vulnerable his force has been since that first encounter with the Persians a couple of years ago in historical timeline, but only 2 or 3 episodes ago, in episode 1 of the podcast. Anyway, so thank you all for listening or watching. If you're watching this on YouTube, don't forget to follow on Instagram at Navigating History. And again, we are now available pretty much anywhere you get your podcasts, except for possibly Apple Podcasts. I'm still working on getting us available on iTunes, but we're definitely available on Spotify or Google Podcasts, and also, of course, on YouTube for free. So, if you want to follow us on Instagram at Navigating History, and on TikTok at Navigating_history. Again, we post updates there, any sort of details, and there will be, quizzes coming up and little questions, and possibly even some Q&As done there as well in the future. So that's the best place to follow this podcast if you're interested in getting updates on new episodes, and getting updates on things, and whether or not the season. And also the ability to vote on a new season as well. When this season ends, there will be a poll on the Instagram page where people can vote on which season they want to see next, and then I will do the season on whatever they want to see next. There'll be 2 or 3 options, and you can vote there. So again, follow on Instagram at Navigating History, and on TikTok at _Navigating History. So thank you very much for everyone who's listening or watching. Thank you so much for all the support on the first 3 episodes as well. It's been fantastic. I'm really enjoying this. Again, this is my first time doing anything like this, so I really hope that everything is going well, and I'm improving, and we're going to get better. So, stay tuned, because there's going to be a heck of a lot more history content coming at you. So have a great rest of your day. If you're listening to this on your Monday morning commute, then I hope your Mondays are okay. If you're listening to this on Sunday night, then hopefully you can go to bed on a good note and start the week on a positive tomorrow morning. Anyway, have a great rest of your day wherever you are in the world, and whatever day you're listening to this, and see you soon.